Hello and welcome to the first session in this two-part student-led initiative co-organized by the Current Affairs Interest Group and the Office of Global Programs of Singapore University of Social Science. I'm Timothy and I'm from the Current Affairs Interest Group and I will be one of the moderators for today's session. So we're still admitting a few people into the session, so yeah. We can, in the meantime, we can grab some snacks or drink while we wait for a bit. All right, in the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to ask in the chat box.
Hi, hello, Prof. Rin. Nice to meet you. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Okay. All right, so I guess I'll just start now. So I'm just gonna hello and welcome again to this virtual dialogue on the topic of racism on a global scale. No, but first, let me give a quick rundown on today's session. So today's session will be divided into two main parts, with the first being we'll try to understand the problem. So you guys, the participants, are encouraged to put in some of your questions in the chat box, and we will get the speakers to answer some of them towards the end of the first part. For the second half of the session, we'll be exploring some possible solutions. For this part, you are encouraged to come up with solutions or build on other potential solutions. You can raise your hands using the Zoom function and we will unmute you, so feel free to do so. And no need to feel shy or anything because ultimately we are all here to learn. Right. Okay. So let's get to it. Now we'll be covering the coronavirus and the hate crimes against Asians and also on police brutality and the Black Lives Matter movement. Today, we have three guest speakers who are experts in their respective fields, and it will be exciting to hear what they have to say regarding these topics. Now, the first speaker is a professor of history, coordinator of humanities, and president of the Faculty Senate at Governors State University. He holds a PhD from the City University of New York and an MA from the University of Virginia. He is also an expert on affirmative action. Let us welcome Dr. 𝗍𝗵𝗀𝗀.
Well, thank you, Timothy, and good morning, Chicagoland, and good evening, Singapore. It's such a pleasure to be with you all this morning, despite the seriousness of this topic. But this is a topic that I know my fellow guest speakers and I have devoted our scholarly lives to, and it's an incredibly important one that we continue to address, especially in light of the pandemic that has raged around our planet these past 15, 16 months. As Timothy said, I come to this discussion from the perspective of history. I am a historian, and I am indeed a scholar of the history of affirmative action. And so when I look at racism on a global scale and racism here in the United States today, I look at it through the prism of its history, and especially the history that I have studied, which is the what we traditionally call the civil rights era in the United States. There is a phrase that we often use from Montgomery to Memphis when we talk about the way historians have often treated the time period of the civil rights era. Montgomery to Memphis being the mid-1950s to the tragic assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In 1968 in Memphis, Tennessee. But a lot of scholars in recent decades have begun expanding our notion of the civil rights era. We've been looking significantly earlier Some people go as far back, say, for instance, as the Nat Turner Rebellion in the early 19th century, and some of us come into the future. And my most recent work, which happens to be a biography of a civil rights leader named Arthur Fletcher, who was Assistant Secretary of Labor during the Nixon administration here in the United States. He was the chairman of the Civil Rights Commission, the United States Civil Rights Commission, during the late 1980s and early 1990s. And I still, as I do my work now, I very much think of that period as part of the civil rights era. I also think that what we're seeing today is less of a resurgence of the civil rights era as it is a continuation of the civil rights era. And so that's sort of the prism that I look through when I see the events like the moment of great justice that we saw earlier this week. I say justice very, very specifically. It was, we can't bring back George Floyd. We can't bring him back to the family that he was tragically stolen from. Nor can we bring back any of the victims of police brutality that have been tragically taken from us over the years. But we can begin to find some small measure of justice if we can hold people accountable who are and should be held accountable. In this case, the police officer who behaved, in my opinion, fascistically and murderously in those horrible 8 minutes, and probably for much of his career up till that point. I'm just, it's a great sort of counterpoint to actually Professor Jones and I were on a panel. Probably it's been 6 or 7 years since we did this panel. It was called After Ferguson, and it was in December, I believe December of 2014. We put together a panel at Governors State University to talk about the events in Ferguson, Missouri, and it was a very, very different outcome in that case. The police officer was not even indicted. And I remember we came there with a sense of continuing frustration and continuing concern for our fellow citizens, that the justice system was not acting in the best interests of all of us, and that it was allowing for it was continuing to allow for the perpetuation of injustice. Now, when I study history and I see Bull Connor in Birmingham, Alabama, driving tanks through the streets to put down peaceful protesters, and I also look at what happened in Ferguson in, gosh, Professor Jones, was it 2014? Was it? I think it was. It's been such a long time already. In the
so much has happened since then. Yes.
Yes. And last summer, of course, with the almost overwhelmingly peaceful protests that took place around the United States in the wake of the police murder of George Floyd, I cannot but help to make this connection that they're one and the same, and that what's important is that we don't look back on history as some sort of a different time, but we look at the continuities and we draw our lessons from the past to help us better, to help us create a better and more positive future. I know I have limited time, so I think I should probably wrap up my initial remarks at this point, and I look forward to the robust discussion and Q&A.
All right, thank you, Dr. 𝗣𝗿𝗀𝗀𝘀. So the next speaker earned his Juris Doctorate at the University of Illinois, John Marshall Law School in Chicago. He has worked for several years as a national trial lawyer before joining the faculty of the Governors State University, and was also the lead trial attorney on several high-profile cases. Let's welcome Professor Vincent Jones.
Good morning, everyone. Very pleased to be here. Very happy to discuss a topic that is both important to me from a scholarly perspective, but also individually. So I bring to this conversation not only my academic experience, but my actual lived experience as a minority in the United States. And my perspective is a little bit different because, as was pointed out, I'm a lawyer. I know how the law is supposed to work. I know how the law is supposed to be blind when looking at anyone and treat us all equally and treat us all fairly. And it is difficult for me as a lawyer to see the inequities in our system and know that our system is not designed to work this way, that it's actually designed for all of us to be treated fairly under the law. But I take this view not negatively. Like David, who is Professor Gallen, I don't want to be too trite with my discussion of my colleague here, but Professor Gallen looks at things from a historical perspective, and I too look at the arc of justice from a historical perspective, and I am very positive about what I see, despite the personal frustrations that I feel at the lack of progress. Progress is much too slow, but it is progress. It's significant progress. And I am encouraged more by the millennials, you students, people of your age group. You are driving the world forward in a way like I've never experienced before in my lifetime. And it's a wonderful thing to see. Even though we have intermittent periods that are very hard to deal with, very hard to accept, the overall view is that the younger generation is rejecting the racism of the past, the structural racism of the past. You're all so very inclusive, and you do it organically. It's very natural for you. The things that have divided my generation and generations before us, you guys don't even see it anymore. And it's a wonderful thing to behold. You know, when I have Thanksgiving at my house and I invite my family, it's like a meeting at the United Nations. My daughter-in-law is from Thailand. My grandchildren are Puerto Rican. My son is dating someone from Costa Rica. My youngest son is dating someone from Mexico. I have a white Caucasian cousin and family from all over the world. And it's a wonderful thing to see that all of us share the same last name, but come from so many different perspectives, so many different parts of the world. So the arc of justice bends slowly, but it bends positively toward justice. Now, having said that, from a general perspective, let me be more precise. Allow me to be very specific. I am very discouraged by the number of police shootings that we see in the United States. As a Black male and the father of 3 Black men, I cannot protect my sons from the injustices that may attack them the minute they leave my house. It doesn't matter how many degrees I have. It doesn't matter how much money I have or don't have. The minute my sons leave my home, they are just like any other Black male. And my wife and I fear for their safety all the time. Even though we live in what is generally considered an upscale neighborhood, it does not offer them any protection at all. And we have to do things that other parents don't have to do. We have this thing in Black America called the talk that every parent has to give to their child. And the talk simply tells your children, especially Black males, what to do when stopped by the police. Move slowly. Keep your hands in view. Don't talk back. You don't have any rights until you get to the police station. No, don't tell the police officers that you know the law, that your dad is a lawyer or anything like that. Don't drive your sports cars late at night. That just sets you up as a target. We've installed cameras. In fact, I just purchased a dual recording camera. This is not a commercial, by the way, but to record any interactions that our children may have when they are out driving or perhaps stopped by the police. So specifically, not from a general sense, but specifically, it is very discouraging that I have to deal with these kinds of issues in a country where everyone is supposed to be treated equally. And I know that even though this is a current problem, we are moving in the right direction. The morning or the afternoon of the George Floyd conclusion, the sheriff, 𝗟𝗃𝗀𝗃𝗀𝗀, I believe his name is, officer, when he was convicted, my family and I sat in front of the TV and we were holding our breath. As a lawyer, I knew there was more than enough evidence to convict Mr. Chauvin. But as a Black man in America, I know that historically, that conviction doesn't take place. And so we sat there holding our breaths, waiting to see if the law would work for us this time, the way it's supposed to work. And gratefully, it did work the way that the law is supposed to work. So I take great comfort in that. I do not believe that that's the end of our problems and that this one case is going to change everything. I believe that it's just one small step in the right direction. And I don't want to give a complete lecture here, so I'll simply say that we're moving in the right direction. The law is in our favor, but more importantly, I believe that the will of people everywhere is in our favor. We're moving in the right direction.
All right, thank you, Professor Jones. So our third speaker for today will be, he holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Asian Studies from the University of Santo Tomas. He's now finishing his Masters of Arts degree in Asian Studies with a specialization in Northeast Asia, China, at the University of Philippines, Diliman. Currently, he's a senior high school faculty member at the Philippine Cultural College, main campus, handling courses on MIL and the humanities and social science. Let's welcome Mr. Roberto Lim.
All right, good evening and good morning or wherever you are in the world. So, all right. So, actually, I have slides with me. So, is it okay to share, Timothy?
Oh, yeah, sure.
All right. Although this, I'll try to make it not as, of course, long as it should be. All right. So, let me also just time myself. So, the topic at hand is more on racism on a global scale. So, it's not just, for example, the vantage point of one area, for example, here in the Philippines, for example, or in the East, if you will, or for example, from the vantage point of America. So it's like, let's try to also combine what's going on in the different, let's say, corners of the world. I mean, let's try. I mean, I will try in 10 minutes. Okay. And then from there, let's proceed with what can we also discuss further. All right. So my slide by now is supposed to be flashed. Am I correct, Timothy? Thank you.
Yep.
All right. So I have like 4 keywords where I would be discussing or where I would be arriving at. So these are presuppositions. So basically, I'm trying to nitpick the basics of where exactly does racism even stem from. And then we come to the sources, like where did we even learn these things? And what are, let's say, the implications that we learned, okay, that we learned these things. So these are the manifestations. And then I have just, for example, I just knew today that there would be a Q&A would be, after the Q&A, we'll be proceeding to also the prospects, which is moving forward with this issue. So I'll just like give at least a very, a very quick overview, if you will. All right. So some of these presuppositions that I'm kind of thinking of, say, for example, because I also kind of teach philosophy in a high school level. So there's kind of like an interesting vantage point as to how do we even understand one another. So meaning to say, there is already an understanding of differences that we come from different backgrounds. Say, for example, if I go to a particular place, I would be identified as Asian immediately. So I would already be Asian, particularly Filipino. So those kinds of things. But a more, let's say, complex variation of my identity would be I'm also Chinese. So how would that actually play out? So I'm already uncovering here like a dimension of race relations or of race dynamics within our country. Say, for example, right now in the Philippines, there's actually like an awkward understanding of the Chinese community, even though that actually that there's a pretty much huge let's say, presence of the Chinese in the Philippines. So how much more can it look like when I, for example, coming from this country, would appreciate and understand issues? Say, for example, when I go to a bigger melting pot or to a relatively bigger melting pot, say, for example, like the United States. So it just goes on and on. And I think that's also where we should understand, or where we should come from when we understand these race dynamics. It's because we have this certain appreciation and even response immediately when we talk about differences. So say, for example, I might be saying truistic statements right here that if no two persons are alike, then there's no two groups that can ever be alike. Say, for example, it's not just an issue between blacks and, for example, African Americans, for example, and white Americans. It's not just, for example, an issue between, for example, in my case, mainland Filipinos and Filipinos, for example, Filipinos and the other, let's say, ethnic groups, because I was thinking also mainland China, there's also, for example, the Han group, together with all the other minority ethnic groups. Like, this is already, okay, a very, let's say, divided world, predetermined, okay, in a very predetermined, let's say, vantage point. We already see that, okay? The next one is the sources. So given that we know that these differences exist, how did we even come to terms that we are all different? So these are basically maintained by a lot of, say, factors. We have the education system, we have the media. So something that I am actually, let's say, focused on lately, because here in the Philippines, I'm also focusing on an advocacy for media and information literacy, and part of which I'm very much passionate about is studying representations of these different, let's say, quote unquote, minority groups in different, let's say, enclaves. Say, for example, here in the Philippines, or even in, let's say, quote unquote, the West. So there's a lot of them going on, and some of them we can say that they're just simply natural and responsive attitudes towards the way that we're different. Like, just for example, because I have a different skin color compared to, for example, my other brethren here in the Philippines, or my other, let's say, friends all over the world. So we already have, let's say, distinguished responses, okay? And some of these responses can either be good or bad. But one iconic work that I always remember whenever we talk about race relations is '𝗿𝗺𝘃𝗳𝗃𝗀𝗄𝐻 Orientalism, because he simply asserts that whatever understandings, all right, they referring to the West, all right, that the West simply has about the Orient is simply accommodating them into the different, let's say, structures and institutions that have been established by the West. So meaning to say, we are expected to understand the Chinese from, let's say, the vantage point of the West. I mean, these people like 𝗿𝗺𝘃𝗳𝗃𝗀𝗃 have been already very, let's say, vocal about the way in which how should we even understand Chinese history. For example, language is a very huge dimension in discussing a country's history. So that's simply just one among the many. So that's on the educational side. But when we talk about, for example, the media, on the other hand, the media is also one very powerful tool that depicts, or at least that attempts to depict reality. Say, for example, we have stereotypes, which some are just simply virtually harmless. I think some of you would agree, because we just get a laugh out of it. Say, for example, we get the laugh out of Asians being tagged as good in math, something like that. Or, for example, what else? That we're entrepreneurial, but of course, not everybody in the Chinese community would be labeled as either good in math or, let's say, entrepreneurial. I, for one, am not entrepreneurial, all right? So that's something that exists. But at the same time, these media texts simply get into our subconscious dimensions of our thinking. Hence, it establishes, what we are now solidifying as even harmful understandings of these different people. Say, for example, the usual stereotypes that would say that this kind of race is a criminal, or this kind of race also is like a drug cartel kind of race. This race is like a yakuza or something. Like, that has been media texts that have been enjoyed by a lot of people. And that's actually the harmful bit about it. People enjoy it. Hence, there's this subconscious dimension of how we get this kind of thinking about other people ingrained in our systems. So the moment that we see, for example, an Asian, there's this connotation. The moment that we see, for example, an African American, there's already this certain understanding that the media was able to feed to you. But the question right there is, of course, is it really quote unquote reality? Well, media scholars would definitely argue that this is just one version, or at least some of the media scholars would simply argue that this is just one dimension of reality. But how come the rest are not as represented as let's say accurately? So this is basically the vantage point that I am coming from as an Asian studies scholar. Simply because, of course, this is my first what they call this exposure, if you will. This is my first exposure about the dynamics of these races. All right. So growing up, especially again here in the Philippines, I am of course already aware that I am part Chinese, part Filipino. But then again, for example, when I go into a school that is like, for example, there's really not much Chinese Filipinos in there. So of course there would be a lot of course, like catching up that has to be done, because not everybody knows one another, and at the same time, it's the first time, or it's probably a lot of people's first time to see a Chinese Filipino. So how do I orient them properly? More so at an early age, do I even have the right material? Do I even have the right worldview? Do I even have the right perspective to tell them what I am as a Chinese and as a Filipino? And it just goes on. So that's pretty much what I have. But then again, what do we do with these? Like, what do we do with these understandings of different races? So it's long-standing. A lot of them are old issues. So one of the professors referenced the idea that the civil rights movement dates like a long way back, like a few decades ago. But although we see some of its fragments until now, hence you have like Black Lives Matter, you also have, let's say, a mobilization in support of the Asian American community in the United States, or even in the West, like Asian communities, Asian enclaves that exist in the West. Of course, there's always going to be that kind of support. But the question here is also, why is still there the need to actually rally support? Like, have we been, let's say, progressing? The other professor, I forgot. So yeah, I would talk to you later, of course, sorry. So the other professor referenced the idea that, of course, there's progress, although it's slow. But the important thing is, at least there's progress. But let's be aware, at least, that this kind of progress is quite slow. And we also need to like give a very gentle nudge, especially to the younger ones, because they're the ones still consuming these kinds of media. They're the ones who still consuming this kind of educational system that seems to favor, for example, a particular race over the other. So what we have also is shared experiences and collective catharsis. That even though some of the attacks towards Asians in the United States, well, what we see here in our media, of course, is that it's actually also started by the African Americans or the Black community. But we also get to see that some of these Black communities, or the Black community in general, would also be vocal and supportive of what the Asians want, which is simply acceptance. All right. So these are the prospects. So I think I'll just give you a very quick preview. I don't want to discuss these things thoroughly, because I think this would be another part. Am I correct, Timothy? So this is another part of the discussion, right?
Yep.
Where are we going? So yeah, so these are my ideas by far, and I think that's what I can share initially in this evening/mornings forum. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Roberto.
Can call me Rob. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Rob. All right. So, yeah, it's a pleasure to have all you three, with us again. So, yeah, let's start with the first question. I want to direct this to the Professor Golan. Right. So you mentioned about the changing notions on the civil rights movement. So what do you think the change is, and how do you see these changes affecting the future of America?
So, I mean, if I read the question literally, this is sort of an academic issue of where we define historical periods. So therefore I'd like to and in terms of that literal answer, it is that academic historians are on a spectrum where the opposite ends are Montgomery to Memphis at one end of the spectrum, which we call the short civil rights movement, and then the folks who subscribe to the idea of a long civil rights movement, and they go both back into the further into the past, deeper into the past, and closer up into towards the present. But I think it's for the purpose of today's talk to be a little bit less literal about the question, to come out of the academic world. I think it's just important to look at the changes and continuities over time, perhaps, and sort of get a discussion going in that way. So I'm so glad that Mr. Lim talked about Asian American discrimination and stereotypes. My own scholarship tends to focus more on sort of the black-white question in United States history. And yet I was just recently, of course, because we had yet another spate of killings here in the United States of Asian Americans in and around Atlanta, Georgia last month. I was exchanging a few emails with a colleague who was rather complaining, frankly, that we're not focusing enough in our institute, in our university. We're not focusing enough on anti-Asian hate and discrimination. And that it seemed to him there were always speeches and moments of silence when, for instance, when George Floyd was murdered, but he wasn't seeing it yet on our campus after the events in Atlanta. And my response was unequivocal. And the first thing I actually did was I emailed the president of the university and I encouraged her to put out a statement. But that's the very basic minimum thing that our leaders need to be doing, is putting out statements of support for victims and the community. What I also said was, as a historian, we need to think about the Chinese Exclusion Act as much as we think about Jim Crow. We need to think about Vincent Chin, and I could give you an hour on Vincent Chin, but I'd rather you just Google him and then do some more deep research on your own, folks. But we need to think about Vincent Chin and remember Vincent Chin as much as we remember Emmett Till. Because both were victims of hate in this country, and they happened at different time periods. Vincent Chin was murdered in the 1980s. Different parts of the country, Vincent Chin was murdered in Michigan. And yet we, as a historian, I think it's important to make these connections. So I think most of us, like I said, I don't want to put us on an academic dichotomy. I don't want to polarize historians, because for the most part, we're all just sort of open. Those of us who are practicing well are sort of open to all sorts of ideas about how to practice history. And so I think very few of us are saying things like, it has to be Montgomery to Memphis, or it has to be the long story. We're just sort of thinking about things and trying to kind of synthesize all these ideas in our own heads and get it all sort of to work together.
All right, thank you, Professor Golan. So we have a question for you, Professor Jones. So you are a lawyer, and what about the US legal system? Do you think it's stopping the US society from moving in the right direction? And or what is needed to help the US in moving faster in the right direction, if it's going to the right direction, like you mentioned just now?
Very good question. Let me approach that question from a couple of perspectives. The first perspective is how the legal system is supposed to work. And when I'm teaching my classes, I always divide it into two sections. This is how it's supposed to work. This is how it actually works. And sometimes they merge together, but usually they're operating on separate tracks. And so if I approach it from how it's supposed to work, I can say that we already have the laws that we need on the books to ensure the safety, the well-being, and the security of every person in this country, regardless of race, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of gender or sexual orientation or preference. We have that under the Civil Rights Act. I filed numerous cases for various forms of employment discrimination based on any of those what we call protected classes: age, ethnicity, sex, gender, etc. And we have enough on the books to protect everyone and to move the society forward. Even as a lawyer, we have to study the history of law and the rulings of the highest court in our country, which is the United States Supreme Court. There was a time when I would not have been considered a complete person. I was considered as an African-American, 3/5 of a man, and therefore not a whole person. And we've seen that from the Dred Scott decision all the way forward to today, where we now are not only considered full rights with full citizenship, but that we can hold people accountable for the mistreatment of anyone that falls into my protected class and other protected classes. So the law is there, it's appropriate, it is doing what it can do what it's supposed to do. But now here's where the divergence occurs. It's all subject to interpretation. And we allow our judges to interpret what the law means. And we lose so much in the interpretation because we have people in position that are interpreting the law from a discriminatory perspective, sometimes intentional, often unintentional. Often it's from a lack of understanding. You know, I just put together a recommendation to our current President Biden on not only expanding our Supreme Court, but expanding the judges that we have and including typical groups that aren't normally considered for judgeships, those people that interpret the law. I've asked that there be an Asian American on the Supreme Court, that there be a Latinx judge placed on the Supreme Court, that we look at other law schools rather than the typical Harvard and Yale and Stanford law schools. Because the people that appear before judges do not come from those backgrounds generally. And we can fashion better rulings when we have a connection to the people that appear before us. I may not have any bias against someone from Alaska, but because I've never been to Alaska, because I don't know anyone that lives in Alaska, I'm not in tune to what it's like to be an Alaskan. And therefore, it is somewhat ridiculous to expect me to make decisions about lives that I know nothing about and have no interaction with anyone that knows about those lives. So we have to make the reality of our legal system join with the actual practice of our legal system so that it represents everyone, that everyone has a voice. And therefore, the interpretation is not just from one perspective. Right now, the average judge is a 50-plus-year-old white male that comes from traditionally 10 different law schools. We have over 300 law schools, any number of minorities, but those who are making the interpretive decisions represent a very small group of individuals from a very small perspective. And I can tell you that most of our judges can't understand the lives of other individuals. And all of us have that problem initially, but it's important that we recognize that, hey, I don't understand what it's like to be, Jamaican in America. So let me educate myself. Let me talk to individuals that have that lived experience. Let me invite people to the table that have that lived experience, whatever that may be, so that not only our laws are equally applied, but our interpretation of the law represents this wonderful mosaic of people that we have in this country. I just wanted to add something else, and that is we are constantly talking, as we should, about the bad actors in our nation, in the United States. And there's many of them, but they are outnumbered by the people of goodwill. I have been throughout my life overwhelmed by the number of people of goodwill that come from every background, from every ethnicity. And it seems that the moment that I'm most discouraged is the time when I will experience a random act of kindness from someone from a different ethnicity. And that is the prevailing theme in this country, not racism, not bias, not discrimination. And so I will say that the law is here to help us keep moving forward. And I'm encouraged by what I see, while equally being discouraged by what I'm experiencing.
All right, thank you, Professor Jones, for your answer. So now I have a question for Mr. Roberto. So you focus a lot on the media representation of minorities. So what do you think that the representation of the racial conflict in the United States and other countries, what do you think that this representation in the media have on, like, let's say, the Southeast Asian society?
All right, so that's a very interesting question. I think let me just start off by saying that it depends on which media type are you even talking about. For example, are you talking about the news? Are you talking about like popular culture? Talking about even in indigenous media? All right, so there are a lot of them, but let's just focus on maybe a few. Say, for example, in the news, I think much recently, what's interesting, especially coming from again, I don't live in America. I would only hear from like what only our local media and even what we can access, what they can just tell us. No? So what's interesting there is they're able to at least tell us, all right, where it's coming from recently. For example, you would automatically say that a lot of the things, a lot of the racial slurs would come from, for example, Donald Trump's rhetoric towards his, in his speeches, for example. But the problem right there is I think it's too simplistic a discussion if you're going to limit it in that kind of perspective. While we're not saying that it's not true, of course. But then again, it stems a lot deeper from, a lot deeper than that. So for example, as I've mentioned earlier in my discussion, a lot of it has already been ingrained in the natural senses of people like us, all right? So the next layer of my answer would be, well, we're talking about the mainstream, but the mainstream is, of course, different depending on who's talking. All right. For example, if it's someone, for example, who's consuming, let's say, let me rephrase it. When you talk about mainstream, it depends on who's talking, and it depends on which do you prefer, of course, or which mainstream, quote unquote, do you even subscribe to. So that's one interesting vantage point right there. For example, if you're subscribing to these Hollywood films, then a lot of it, of course, would be by, for example, American directors, American producers of these films and whatnot. So a lot of these things would also come from their perspective, from their versions of reality, and it just simply applies from different, again, from different types of media. Whether we're talking about, again, the news, we're talking about popular culture, talking about even scholarly media. So we're talking about books, talking about journals. So that really depends on who's writing, who's even doing the storytelling. I think that's one thing that we need to, let's say, consider whenever we really try to give an assessment of how is, let's say, the media representation of race X appearing, so something like that. But to have an answer, yeah, it's basically dependent on also what's readily available to the people. So what's readily available to, let's say, the bigger audience. So a lot of it, just really speaks political economy of the media. It speaks a lot of things about who has the power to even reach a lot of these audiences. So I think that's quite a simplistic discussion, although not reductionist, hopefully. But because I would also want to have a few more of the questions, and I would also want to listen more to the others. So I think that's where I can end it. So to summarize, it's looking at who's doing the storytelling, and at the same time also looking at what are these sources? Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Rob. So actually, I have a question for you, Professor Golan. So you are an expert on affirmative action, right? What do you think about affirmative action within a, like, let's say, a meritocratic society like Singapore? How do you think it can be implemented into a society like us?
So I'm aware on a very broad level of affirmative action programs outside of the United States. But I put up scare quotes, as you said, as you called me an expert, because I think of myself as a student, a permanent and perpetual student of affirmative action, rather than an expert. But I'm certainly not an expert on affirmative action, either the programs or the need for affirmative action outside of the United States. So what I would do is I would ask to, I could tell you a little bit about why it was necessary and remains necessary in the United States, what it is and what it is not. And then I would ask the writer of the question and anyone else who's interested to go back and think about whether those conditions apply to your own society. And so in the United States, still today, despite something being called affirmative action having existed for the past 50 years, there continues to be rampant discrimination against people who are considered in the other category, whatever that other category is, everything from people with disabilities to African Americans, right, and to my own people, the Jewish people. And because of this continuing discrimination, there has been a need to try to level the playing field. President Johnson, who was the president who during the 1960s kind of jump-started the idea that we ought to be engaged in affirmative action, he had a great, I'm going to paraphrase him because I don't have his quotation right in front of me, but he said, you cannot take two people and put them on the starting line of a race when one of them has already run, this is a huge paraphrase, I'm leaping quite a bit here. If one of them has already run a marathon and the other one is fresh, and you put them on the starting line, you can't call that a fair race, even though they're starting at the same place and at the same time. And the fact is that historically, at that time and still today, African Americans had to work twice as hard to get half as far. And so the purpose of affirmative action is to try to level the playing field. What affirmative action is not, and what it often is accused of being by people in opposition to it, is an unfair advantage to people who don't deserve it. It's not, say, for instance, hiring unqualified people at the expense of hiring qualified people. It's not putting unqualified people in elite college seats at the expense of qualified people because of race. The way I describe it in my first book, Constructing Affirmative Action, that's the gray one above my head here, from 2011, is that it's about thinking of every possible way you can to even and level the playing field. For instance, if you go to apply for a job and no one, this is like what Professor Jones was talking about when it comes to the Supreme Court, if no one in human resources at the place you're applying for the job resembles you, why would you have any confidence that your application for the job would get fair treatment? Therefore, why would you even apply for the job? And so one way you can engage in affirmative action is by hiring an HR person, hiring someone to work in the personnel department who understands more of the community that might potentially be applying for jobs. Another form of affirmative action is, this comes up a lot when we search for new faculty members, advertising in more that sounds very 20th century, I know, but I'm a historian and that's the century I focus on. And if you can just imagine, folks, when I say publications, think about social media or whatever the current interpretation is for how we do these things. But if you're, well, that's a good example. I mean, if I'm looking to hire someone under 25, I should not be putting my advertisement in the New York Times only. Now, it's true, people under 25 do read the New York Times, but if I really want to get someone under 25 and I really want to expand that pool of eligible applicants, I need to be advertising on Twitter. I need to be advertising on all the things that I probably don't have at the tip of my tongue because I'm not engaged in them because I'm a mid-generation X person. All of that is affirmative action. Affirmative action is also funding Head Start programs so that our preschoolers get a good solid pre-K education so that they're starting kindergarten at the same level. Because we're still seeing in 2021 that 5-year-olds are not starting at the same level in school, and there's still underrepresentation in the better schools. I mean, the fact that we even talk about better schools when we should be making sure that every single school in this country and in this world is giving an elite first-class education to every single child. We're just not doing it. And so when it comes to, so then affirmative action then is trying to find ways to change that, but just thinking about the entire spectrum of doing it. Pipeline, and at the hiring moment, and at the college application moment. And so yeah, I hate to, like Professor Jones, I'm not technically advertising, but by all means, you know, read more about these arguments in my book, Constructing Affirmative Action from University Press of Kentucky, 2011.
All right, thank you, Professor Cullen. So now we have one more question that, you know, any of the speakers can answer, and actually, in fact, I want all the speakers to answer. It's, you know, how do you think these racial differences and, you know, for lack of a better term, how do you think racism will play out in the future? You know, are you optimistic about the future, or yeah? Any of you can start first.
I'll dive in and give a brief answer so that the rest of my colleagues can answer as well. I'm typically a perpetual optimist, and I'm no different now with my view of how racism will be in the future. As I mentioned earlier, what I see with the millennial generation and even younger is this abiding sense of unity, of accepting people from all walks of life. And the way that it is done so simply and naturally. It's not an effort like it was with my generation, where we had to actually work to be more inclusive. It just happens now. And it's a beautiful thing to watch. And so I see things moving in the right direction. I'm extremely optimistic. I think that we are seeing in the middle a conflict between those who want to hold on to the way things were, facing those who are trying to make America what it always has professed to be. And I believe those of us who are working to make it what it has professed to be, I think we're winning. And so I'll stop there and say I'm very optimistic about the future.
I'll defer to Mr. Lim if he'd like to go first. Go next, second, that is.
All right, so I'll just also try to make it as quick as I can again, so that from my vantage point, I think let's start with what I do, let's say, observe here in the Philippines. I think it's still an awkward situation because there's still, let's say, this Tagalog supremacy. I mean, it's like the majority, or let's say at least a Manila kind of center. And there's still like Manila centrism going on, like in a lot of respects of society, whether you're talking about the media, whether you're talking about even reportage, even like, well, that's what I see here though. So I think that's what my perspective can just give the rest of the people here in the body. What else? Although if you've been following our politics, for example, there's been a high surge of support for non-Manila politics. Say, for example, that's a reason why, for example, our president Rodrigo Duterte was even elected back in 2016. So, I mean, I'm not even sure if a lot of that is race or if a lot of that is ethnicity. But of course, that's just one of the many dimensions of what I can comment maybe on the state of let's say, race dynamic here in the Philippines, or ethnic dynamic here in the Philippines. But globally, I also would like to be maybe as optimistic, all right? But at the same time, of course, there's still a lot of challenges. Say, for example, as we've already mentioned earlier, there's still this resurgence of old issues. Aside from the United States, of course, even globally, there's still this strong resurgence that we have to resist, all right? That we have to resist, and at the same time, we also need to re-educate ourselves upon. So in my earlier stint, I talked about how the media and how the educational system can be a subconscious, especially that the teachers do it, the students can also acquire it, and they can just pass it on, and it just becomes a cycle. Like at some point, this kind of progressive, new, or maybe not even new, maybe a fresh perspective about how we can even introduce the idea of racial diversity, for example, or how we can introduce the idea of racial, let's say, harmony or multiculturalism. Say, for example, that's one of the things that I can admire relatively, for example, in Singapore. Like Chinese, Indians, Malays, among others, can coexist. Like in the Philippines, I am yet to maybe celebrate that kind of, let's say, existence among the different, let's say, ethnicities in the Philippines. But yes, I think I am quite optimistic. It's just a matter of how we go there, because we have these different perspectives. So whose perspective are we again going to go with? So that's just gonna start a new discussion. And I see that in the chat box, yeah, because we also have some attendees in Davao, yeah. So Kenneth is my colleague in Pamil. So hello, Kenneth, among my many colleagues actually, and some of my students here. All right, so I would now yield the floor to, I think that's Professor David now.
Thank you. And I have to be honest, I sort of oscillate between optimism and pessimism. As you were speaking during your initial presentation, Mr. Lim, I was thinking about the changes that have taken place in terms of stereotypes in the media in the past century or so. And by media, I mean all of it, you know, from television advertisements to newspaper to social media to everything. And in my grandparents' time, the stereotypes that pop out to me, for instance, are that, and I'll just be frank here because these are false stereotypes, but they're understood, was that Italian Americans were members of the mafia and Jews were dirty. And I'm heartened by the fact that I've seen so many more positive depictions of those two ethnic groups in the past 30 years. You know, I've personally never been called a dirty Jew. It's not as if I don't know that anti-Semitism exists. It does exist. We saw it in Charlottesville in 2017 when folks with tiki torches were chanting, "Jews will not replace us." I know it's out there, but that particular stereotype seems to be gone. It's as if the right wing has figured out that yes, we all do have access to indoor plumbing, and Italian Americans are thriving. In fact, although I disagreed with his jurisprudence, Justice Scalia showed that, you know, Italian Americans are not mostly criminals, and in fact they're not. And so over time, these depictions in the media do change, and the media has indeed caught up, you know, and yet both of those ethnic groups contribute to what we now today call whiteness studies. So this field in academia for the past 20 years, which has shown that because of the color of the skin of these ethnic groups, the fact that they mostly draw from European countries has allowed them to assimilate in ways in which African Americans and Asian Americans cannot. And so when we think about how, I mean, the right-wing so-called replacement theory is this idea that by the 2040s, whites will be a minority in the United States. When I think about that, though, I worry, so that's actually, I think it would be a good thing if whites were the minority, but I think that actually the idea of what constitutes majority and minority has changed throughout the history of this country. It changes everywhere and throughout history all over the world. But 200 years ago, when we thought about the majority in the United States, we thought about white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. WASP, right? We don't think that anymore. In fact, there are no white Anglo-Saxon Protestants on the Supreme Court today. And so I wonder if, and this is where I get a little pessimistic, if by the 2040s, if Latinos have been made white by the 2040s, if other groups have been pulled into whiteness by the 2040s, then there's a real danger here that we could continue to have a majority that is still a majority, a discriminating majority that is still a majority. What worries me on this score is how well Trump did in the various Latino communities. And I say that in a plural because there's no monolithic Latino community in the United States. But Trump did surprisingly well in Texas and Florida in the Latino communities in those states. And part of that is a motivation to blend in, to, I've seen it in my own people, this idea to merge with the dominant white culture. And part of merging historically with the dominant white culture is being racist against African Americans and Asian Americans historically. And that's I think, something that we should continue to be very concerned about. But on the other hand, like Dr. Jones and Mr. Lim, I am personally an optimistic person, and I'm always looking for ways to see the bright side on all that. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Professor Golan. So now actually I have a question for you. So you just now in your answers, you highlighted a theme of an organic movement against racism. Oh, so actually this is supposed to address to Professor Jones. All right. So yeah, just now you mentioned about the theme of an organic movement against racism among US youths, right? So do you see the political correctness movement as part of it? And what are some of the discussions around political correctness and free speech? And what future do you see regarding that, especially on the topic of free speech?
That is an outstanding question. And I wish that I could give you an equally outstanding answer, because the answer is yet to be determined to that question. There is so much debate about not only the right of free speech, but the limitations of free speech. And I was recently in a conversation with a group of lawyers, and we were talking about this one news station in the United States called Fox News, which perpetuates every form of racism you could imagine, xenophobia, you name it, that is the home base for it. And the question from a legal perspective was, where does their right to free speech end, and what limitations should we place upon their ability to spew this misinformation and outright lies? And there is no clear answer, because the First Amendment protects everyone's right to express themselves with very limited restrictions. And so one person that we were discussing this issue with was had worked for the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. And one of the questions posed was, should the Federal Communications Commission force them to have disclaimers, just like we have on cigarettes, that, this is hazardous to your health? Should we have a disclaimer that says listening to Fox News is hazardous to your brain? It's going to affect your perspective negatively. So listen with caution. And as mirthful as that may sound, I think that makes a lot of sense, because a lot of people believe that they are listening to news when they hear these extreme statements coming from this particular news station. And so to specifically address the question without answering it, I will say that we're going to need new interpretations of what free speech means. And I don't know where that limit should be. I simply know that we should have limits. And that's dangerous too.
All right, Thank you, Professor Jones. So I think we have questions from the audience. I'll just unmute them.
Hello. Hi, wonderful speaker. So I have this very complex question. So, well, not really complex, but say in a lot of say police or military uniform services, they have a different or a wayward culture that ranging from not calling out colleagues to casual racial slurs. That's usually the public wouldn't have access to, but it's a very strong cultures. And so can I have the panelists think of in what ways can we introduce more transparency and more balance to these kind of different niche groups?
So it's tough because throughout the United States, a lot of police departments are characterized rather similarly to the construction workers that I looked at in my first book. And in those cases, even though it required a skill and it required a training, just like becoming a police officer requires skill and it requires training at a police academy, one hopes. All too often, these coveted slots would go to the nephews and the sons, let alone, by the way, the nieces and the daughters. I mean, that's a whole other area of action that actually affirmative action for women has been very successful in the United States. Far more successful than affirmative action for African American and Asian American and other minorities. But going to these sons and nephews of these existing police officers creates the need for real affirmative action on the police force. On the other hand, once you're in the police culture, there seems to be a culture of don't turn against your quote unquote brother officer, symbolized by the idea of the thin blue line. And that's something that I think we need to continue to work on. The movement in the United States to defund the police, which I think is the opposition to it probably oversimplifies what it's trying to do. I think rather than the idea that we simply have no policing, I think there's a wide variety of opinions that are legitimate on the question of defunding the police. For instance, should we be paying our police officers to do traffic stops when perhaps most traffic stops could be done by unarmed police employees whose job is simply to get you to slow down and give you a ticket rather than wave a gun at you. And perhaps we leave the real armed police work to the more serious criminal behavior. But just sort of re-examining all those things, I think, comes under the rubric of defund the police. And it's just yet another idea in the growing toolbox of ideas for how to break down this problem, in my opinion, of police insularity and yeah, I guess police insularity is probably the best way to put it.
All right. Thank you, Professor Gulen.
I know Professor Jones probably wants to talk about that too.
Well, I was collecting my thoughts because you raised so many issues that I have concerns with and thoughts about, and I could literally talk for the next couple of hours on policing, and I obviously won't do that. But I will say that we need to reimagine policing. Policing has, particularly in the African American community, has a horrible past that extends all the way back to the slave catchers and the Fugitive Slave Act. And a lot of that mindset has been passed down from generation to generation that affects how policing is conducted today. I live in a village that is 3% minority in Frankfort, Illinois. And I often use the example of, in this predominantly white village that I live in, could you imagine having an entirely Black police force regulating the citizens of this village? It would never happen. But we have that routinely in African-American neighborhoods where there are predominantly white officers that are patrolling and regulating the Black communities or other minority communities. And it's almost like an overseer on a plantation that's trying to keep the slaves in line. I don't want to go too deep here, but we have to reimagine what a modern police force is, how it conducts itself. I'm putting together a seminar panel discussion right now where we're going to talk about this particular issue and what we can do to make policing more responsive. The questioner, Mr. Ting, asked a very important question about transparency. There's so much reluctance by police to be transparent. It is incredible. I've handled a number of police brutality cases in my career as a trial lawyer, and it is the resistance is absolutely palpable. And I want to be very clear that when it comes to policing, something happens when individuals put on that blue uniform, and it happens regardless of race. Some of the worst experiences I've had with police officers has been with Black police officers and suing them for brutality against other Black people. It's almost like they're trying to assimilate and say, look, if you think you can be hard on Black people, watch what I can do. And it's a horrible reaction, one that we have got to reimagine, and we've got to address it. And I'll stop there and simply say that we have a lot of work to do when it comes to policing.
All right, Ms. Lim, do you have anything?
Can I add to what Professor Jones just discussed about
Yeah, sure.
yeah, the reimagining dimension? Because I think what I can also maybe say about it is there's a lot also to reinvent about how the people on the ground see the police force. So that's also going to be one thing that we need to also, let's say, try addressing at the end of the day. Because there's this, for example, either dominant narratives of the police being either, let's say, corrupt agents of, let's say, institutions, but at the same time, it's also, let's say, the prevalence of narratives of a lot of heroism and virtue. But we don't necessarily see, for example, a realistic dimension of what it's like really to become a police, say, so to become a police officer. So we keep on just simply seeing, let's say, what is really produced by, say, for example, those who have the agenda when they produce their media messages. And I think that's also going to be essential from the vantage point of media consumers, because they're also going to be, or well, at least we try to imagine too, coming from the media literacy side of things, we try to also imagine, let's say, a society that tries to also seek what else can we think of when we see these groups also being represented, regardless of race, or even when there's a race involved at the end of the day. So we're seeing that, no? So that's actually what I can also add to that, if it makes sense more. I mean, if it makes sense. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I think in the interest of time, we'll have one more question. I believe Charles has a question. Keep unmute. All right.
Good evening, everyone. Good morning, and thank you so much, Sir Bruce, for the opportunity. And good evening, good morning to our dear speakers. These questions is for Sir Roberto. If it's okay, sir, my honor to meet you, sir, virtually. May I ask, sir, did we have programs or platforms that promotes inclusivity in terms of Asian protection, sir? For us, maybe we can join and participate in terms of this advocacy platform, sir, in the midst of this global pandemic and virtual platform, sir.
All right. So can I address that now, Timothy?
Yep, sure.
All right. In terms of let's say groups, interest groups, to be honest, I'm not quite knowledgeable as of now, but I do know a lot of, let's say, organizations that concentrate on, let's say, these advocacies, or at least concentrate on these outcomes. Say, for example, on tolerance, or for example, on awareness, at least, no, of these different quote unquote ethnic groups or minority groups that may, let's say, exist, no? Even in our country, for the in the Philippines, I suppose. All right, so we can also talk about it in a Filipino vantage point. But yeah, interest groups do exist. All right. Say, for example, we have, in my case, I am also affiliated with the Chinese Studies Association here in the Philippines. And so it's called Philippine Association for Chinese Studies. So it's that straightforward. I think there are also counterparts on that in other, let's say, areas, because I'm an area studies guy, you know. So I think I am aware enough that there are counterparts on, let's say, Japan, Korea. I think the Korean Cultural Center is one institution that also caters to interests on these kinds of matters. I just recently heard, though, of also a youth group that is interested in mobilizing ASEAN-China, let's say, what they call this, ASEAN-China cooperation. All right. So, for example, one of the members of the organizing team, I think Lokesh is in the participants list. Yeah. So he was one of these people that I met back when I was in Hainan, Jilin, and Heilongjiang. So these are kinds of opportunities that actually exist. For the Philippines, I can also add one more. There's also the Youth Commission that hosts a lot of these events, if not interest groups. So there are a lot of opportunities, and I suppose there are also a lot of dialogues, intercultural dialogues, that also are hosted, say, for example, in the United States. I'm not just sure exactly what they are. Or, for example, in Europe, maybe, of course, Professors David and Professors Jones can also add to that, because they have more deets on what's going on in America. So basically here in the Philippines, I think that's what we have. Okay. So I hope that does address your concern. But if you can also, I mean, if you would want, I left my contact details around the slide earlier. I can give it to you also later. So yeah.
All right. So unfortunately, I understand that we have some questions in chat, but we're actually running low on time here. So yeah, I would like to wrap things up soon. Thank you once again to all speakers for coming down. Do you have any other last words for the participants in this seminar?
I'll just let the audience know that I'm putting my email and my website in the chat box for everyone.
Doing the same.
There we go.
I even added my Instagram. I think Instagram is the most widely used across different geographical areas, because I heard that there are some, of course, who are not as exposed in Facebook, I think. Yeah, so I added Instagram. Shameless plug. I'm sorry.
Oh, but that's a good point. So we should always be, when we're seeking to do affirmative action, we should always be making sure we're using Instagram. To my previous point. Yeah.
All right. So yeah, I think that about concludes it. So thank you once again to all the speakers for coming down and sharing their insights on these very complex issues. You know, it's unfortunate that we don't have the time to cover every single questions. But yeah,
Timothy, I think I would at least want to address one question, but in a very quick sense. Like I just have one very quick statement about it.
Okay, sure.
I saw a
Yep.
question on basically
Xenophobia. Yeah.
xenophobia. Yeah,
Sure.
all right. So I think it's just one one sentence, I promise. All right. It's an elephant in the room, especially if this question is contextualized in the Philippines, more so if it is in the United States even. So I think the best way to always deal with it is, let's start with, sorry if there are some C's because there are people also here in the house. So the point right there is we have to address it immediately. We have to make a lot of people more aware. We have to make a lot of people more proactive. And I think that's how we can at least start, or at least jumpstart addressing this issue, because somehow, some way we have to. Thank you, Timothy, and my apologies.
And isn't it great that we have a United States president that no longer is calling COVID the Chinese flu,
The Kung
for
flu.
instance? All right, yes, even worse, yeah.
Okay, for now, I would like to actually take this opportunity to promote our own interest group as well. So we are a student-led interest group that aims to advocate the importance of understanding contemporary issues and international developments in the globalized 21st century. So strategically poised to receive students and young professionals from all across all disciplines, Current Affairs IG aspires to create a community of forward-thinking learners that can engage constructively. So we host talks and activities like this on a wide spectrum of topics that guarantees to satisfy your curiosity. So why wait? Follow us on LinkedIn and Instagram to stay up to date and join the conversation today. So as you can see, we have the QR code here. Right. Yes, that concludes it. With that being said, for those who are coming for part 2 of this series, we'll see you guys on Friday. Right, goodbye.